Hey everybody, welcome back. Today I want to give you a little bit of the backstory on my new book, Taming Your Money Monster, 9 Paths to Money Mastery with the Enneagram. For those of you who are curious and want to know a little bit how this book came about and what some of the big ideas and breakthroughs in it are, I'll kind of go through those with you here kind of quickly. But this was really a 7-year project to bring this book to completion. And it was very hard to write, I have to admit. It was not, and no book is easy to write, I don't think. But one of the things I found that the easier a book is to read, the harder it is to write. So I tried to make this a very readable book, very accessible, filled with stories and lots of humor and anecdotes. And to take this complicated thing called the Enneagram and bring it down into sort of a practical way that anybody can find accessible and understandable and applicable to their personal life, both to their for their psychological and spiritual health, but also, most importantly, to their financial life. And my goal when I was looking for, well, what do I write about? It wasn't about the Enneagram. That wasn't the first topic that I hit on. What I was trying to do was find an ethical framework that would transcend religion, politics, and culture to help people have a healthier relationship to money. Like, what would be an ethical framework for better money decisions that we might all be able to find common ground on? And the first system I was working with was a thing called spiral dynamics and integral theory, which is super crazy complicated. And I really lost about 2 years of time trying to make that book work. And it worked, but it wasn't going to be something that anybody was ever going to want to read. And when I sent the first draft of that proposal out to my publisher, they're like, yeah, no, try again. And so I didn't want to lose my book deal. And I'm like, well, okay, what else could fit the bill here? And I started brainstorming, and I thought about the Enneagram, which at the time I knew enough to be dangerous, but not enough to really be conversant enough to write a book about it, that's for sure. So I had to go do some homework and really dig into it, but I figured since spiral dynamics and integral theory is way more complicated than the Enneagram, if I could make it work intellectually there, I could find a way to pull it off here with this book. And fortunately, it worked out great. It turned out to be the perfect way to address this issue of money and ethics and psychology and all the things around behavioral finance that I'm exploring in the book. But I had to really change the Enneagram in some key ways in order to pull this off, because most authors do a really good job of explaining how the Enneagram works, but I haven't found a lot of authors explaining why the Enneagram works. It's sort of always remained for me a little bit in the woo-woo or esoteric realm. And without an understanding of the why behind it, as a type 3, it just sort of, I feel lost in a system that if I can't, I also have kind of a math science background, that's my geeky side. So I really wanted to be able to figure out what's the why behind it, what's the underlying mechanics of the Enneagram that make it work. And so I had to really rejigger a lot of terminology in this book to make it more streamlined, because the Enneagram, it isn't something that we invented. It's something we discovered, right? So it's more like mathematics or science. These are the rules of consciousness. Like the Enneagram, I think, explains in part how consciousness develops in a human being. And in order to have a consciousness, you have to have a conscience, right? So you have to have a sense of what's right, what's wrong, what's good, what's bad. And the Enneagram kind of explains how that evolves inside of a human psyche. And as a result, it tells us like what a consciousness is, and it gives us a sense of ethics. It's the underlying mechanics, I believe. I don't think this is an overstatement to say it's really the spiritual mechanics that undergirds and underpins all of our spiritual traditions and world religions. So it doesn't really matter whether you're into, praying the rosary or burning sage, or, you just yell at the universe when you stub your toe, right? We all have this sense of right and wrong that we can agree that there are virtues like honesty and courage and generosity and, and protecting the weak and all these things that we intuitively have as a human species. We may disagree on how to best practice them according to our different traditions, but we don't disagree that these virtues are real and that they're inside of us, and we know when we're violating our internal sense of right and wrong. That's our consciousness telling us, hey, you're not living your life maybe in an optimal way. And the universe has a funny way of giving you feedback about that. Of course, people around you will tell you when you're not doing something right. But how do we agree on these things? And the Enneagram really explains how and why that's the case. So in order to make that model accessible to a wide audience, one of the things that the biggest revolution I've made with the Enneagram is putting it into this new three-dimensional model, this what I call the double cone Enneagram. And that really maps our spiritual journey that all of us are going on. We know whether we know it or not. It's the evolution of our psyche from early infancy and childhood to developing into a sense of separate identity or self, or how we individuate, and then how we come to the highest spiritual of awakenings that all of our traditions are leading us to. And in order to build that model, there's a couple of other big breakthroughs I made. One is in this thing I call your sacred wound, which really delves into the childhood wounding theory around the Enneagram more robustly and grounding it in neurobiology, which is really exciting. We've got some great new research out there by Dan Siegel, Salah Valander, Jack Killian, a bunch of these other folks who are out there who are really exploring the neurobiology and the scientific underpinnings for the Enneagram, try to pull that into the book, again, in an accessible way. And then also, it sounds like a lot, and it is, I've also layered on top of that a Jungian understanding of our shadow, or the darker sides of our personality that the Enneagram is teasing out and teaching us about. Like, what are our, where do we get stuck in our Enneagram type in our sort of worst moments? What are what I now call our ego addictions, or our worst vices that show up according to our personality patterns? And then developing a real map, or an ego map, for each of the 9 types to both understand your shadow, but also your enlightenment structure. What is this thing that enlightenment that we talk about it in an elusive way, but it turns out in the Enneagram system, it isn't the same path for all of us. There isn't sort of a one-size-fits-all to spiritual and emotional health. Of course, that couldn't be the case. And so then the Enneagram tells you what that path is for you, and I've really laid that out in it's not an easy path, but it is a clear and linear path that you can see it in an ego map in just one page, which is, I think, a really big breakthrough. And then, what are the actual practices that you within your Enneagram type might incorporate into your spiritual life, into your psychological health, and ultimately so they can transform your relationship to not everything, but most particularly to your relationship to money, and help you overcome the money monsters that we've gone through in other videos. And then, of course, the last thing that I think is a big breakthrough with this book is the attachment theory of money, which I've developed again, and I've talked about it that extensively in other clips. But what I've done is take the attachment theory of relationships, which some of you might be familiar with, and applied that to money. And what it says is we can be anxious in our financial life in some areas where we cling too tightly, we're too obsessed about money, maybe in unhealthy ways that show up in our behavior patterns and how we earn, save, invest, and give. Or it can be, tend to be avoidant, which is something I've had to overcome. Like people like me, I talk about money all the time. As a former investment advisor, obviously I had to get over this stuff. But my natural inclination when I became a monk for 20 years was to reject the world of money and materialism, to get away from it. I wanted nothing to do with it. Of course, because of my childhood wounds and all the stuff that I had growing up. We all have our baggage from childhood. But overcoming that money avoidance and pushing money away. And so layering that on top of the Enneagram gives you a real path to not just spiritual and emotional health, but to financial health. And I really hope you guys take the time to read this book. Pre-orders are now available from booksellers everywhere. It releases July 8th, and you can get your copy now. So please order a copy, and I hope you find it insightful, illuminating, and that it really brings you insight, healing, and ultimately joy. Thanks.